Hello everyone and welcome to this Games Lab from the Manchester Game Studies Network. My name's Sam Illingworth and I'm delighted today to introduce Mick Chesterman, who's going to be talking to us about raiding the arcade, and it's going to be a very interactive and enjoyable talk, no doubt. So I'm going to switch my video off, Mick, and take it away.
Okay. Hello, welcome. So before I really get started with a bit of background information and some of the findings that I've come up with, I just wanted to invite you to play a little game as we're kind of maybe waiting for some people to arrive as well. So if you have a look in the chat or try and copy this from the screen, it's a game which was actually made by MMU students in preparation for year 5 of local primary schools visiting Met. Now this was scheduled for April, so it didn't actually happen, but it will give you an idea of the kind of game making that's possible with the tool that we're going to I've been using for my research. It also kind of allows you a chance to kind of open a browser. A bit later on, we'll be kind of doing a bit of interactive work where I invite you to just remix the game so that it gets the browser open as well. So when the kids arrive, we would have invited them to play the game and try and get a high score. And if you want to, you can share the high score that you get in the chat that happens here as well. So I'll just put that in. If anyone completes all 3 levels, I will be very impressed. So in the spirit of multitasking, I'll give a bit of background information about the study, and then I'll give a bit of an overview of what we're going to cover. So in terms of the whole picture, my studies have been about game making with home educated families. And this came about through my work in the Manchester Metropolitan Faculty of Education. I work there doing outreach work, working with local community groups, but also local families as well. And interestingly enough, one of the things that came out of a consultation that we did with those families, where we asked them to map down the different activities that they did in the area and to kind of write down some of the things that they'd like to do, but they were not able to. One of the things that really came up was their interest in making games, playing games, and also the parents' interest in leveraging that interest from their children into a learning activity. And they really were looking to us to try and provide that, to provide what they thought was an opportunity to maybe do some coding or something related to that, that they didn't have the expertise to do. So making games was not my speciality and still isn't really, but teaching people coding in accessible ways kind of was. And so that's the start point, and this is the end point. This is like the latest game making showcase that we did, where families at the end of 5 weeks of kind of playful 2-hour game making sessions shared the games that they'd made together. And they shared them in the foyer of Burke's MMU building, and they got students who were passing to play them and to kind of give them feedback on their game. So that was kind of the end point. And I say that game making wasn't my speciality, and that's true enough, but kind of this idea of doing creative coding is something that I've always been interested in. And it kind of stems from, I suppose, what you could call like an empowerment agenda, the idea of understanding what goes on underneath the hood of a technology being something that's really important for a sense of well-being and kind of participation in that digital world, and also the importance of like real tools, authentic contexts. I think that often that really came from my interest in quite messy learning situations, whether they're like street parties or protest camps or free festivals. There was a lot of learning happening there in that kind of environment. Oh, that is a good high score, I've got to say. All levels complete. So, you know, that kudos to Sam for completing that game. There's a tricky bit, there's a trap, but he didn't get caught in there. So my challenge, I suppose, was can I recreate this kind of messy community of learning and a playful spirit in a more structured way for these home educated families making games. So it also linked to kind of like some work I've been doing recently called Scavengers. We started a Scavengers CIC and working with families, like breaking apart technology, taking things apart with screwdrivers, seeing what makes them tick, and then trying to recombine those parts for creative projects as well. And again, cycling back, I think it's just, in these days, it's really important to have a view of technology that empowers you rather than exploits you. So with that as a background, I'd kind of like to link it to other game making studies that are already out there, and just establish some sort of foundations that there as well. So I would say that kind of the work of Seymour Papert on logo and the use of robotic turtles. Here we've got Papert with a robot drawing machine called a Turtle. That work of getting kids controlling the robot to draw things, and that kind of hands-on concrete approach to coding and creative computing is like a real foundation for me. And I think there is a link with the empowerment agenda there as well. The overall summary of like what he would call a constructionist approach is there on the screen. There's a lot of research on this in the field of digital making. So broader than games, the use of these kind of hands-on, project-based community approaches to learn things in a less structured way than you might through learning coding from first principles is quite well covered in research. And more specifically for games, Kafai and Burke have got a really good book on this. I know Sam did a book review on this, looking at the summary of the studies that are out there for making games in particular and the value of that. I would say one criticism of this book would be that maybe it's too broad in what it's trying to do, and that it lumps in all of the benefits of broader digital making along with game making, and doesn't so much cover really explicitly what's special about game making. So I'm going to try and do my best to focus this talk a little bit on what's special about game making. The kind of three main elements of my study are making games, doing it in a family environment, and kind of coding as the mechanism for doing that. So in this talk, I am going to cover mostly things to do with games and kind of what's special about games. I kind of will look at the concept of funds of knowledge. How can we draw on those? I'll also look at giving you a bit of hands-on experience with a tool called MakeCode Arcade, which I think is really useful, not just for kids, but I think could be adapted for adults and students in HE, FE. So we'll have a look at that, see if that could be useful to you. And then also I'll draw on like 3 strands of findings and design decisions that I've made that I think have got real potential. I'm about halfway through this research now, so just sharing these emerging findings. So to crack on, that with funds of knowledge, this is a concept originated by Mole and colleagues, but also kind of picked up on by Elizabeth Moche, who looked at how can you draw on the existing knowledge of learners and participants when you're, and she was working it in third spaces. So this is not in the home environment, this is not in the school environment, but it might be in an after school club, or it could be in a community group. So she was looking at third spaces and what's special about third spaces, and what's the potential on drawing on the expertise of your participants when you're creating a new learning community, and also the importance of dealing with something familiar when you're asking your learners to engage with something unfamiliar as well. So I'm really inspired by that. And also, I did a lot of research a couple of years ago. I suppose it's still ongoing. Just starting to do this, going out, doing creative coding sessions. You can see here, like on the slide, this is a half-term activity that I did in Brooks. And with students, we broke down, we asked young people to plan a platform game, or any game really, using textiles and using paper printouts of characters that they designed. And we can see them here like narrating what would happen in their game. So they're moving things around, they're saying, well, what happens here? Other people are asking questions. They're going through the game and using these physical props, and they've got a shared sense of what the game should be like, of when conventions are interesting or when conventions are being broken. So really, games provide like a very rich source of like funds of knowledge, and it's not all good. So I think there are kind of real advantages to drawing on games as funds of knowledge, but there are also potential pitfalls as well. I mean, when it comes to, I want to quickly say, let's not ignore the family as a fund of knowledge as well. For my study, just the fact that we're making games together, and I didn't really take on the advice of home educators in terms of taking the kids and teaching them just directly. It was much more kind of, let's use the funds of knowledge of the experiences of the family to make games together. There's a really interesting study called Family Creative Learning by Burke, and I interviewed someone who was a part of that research team, and they shared really interesting strategies for just celebrating the skills that parents bring in that kind of relationship, in terms of supporting their young people through difficult experiences of using technology. That also drew on the work of Bridget Barron in terms of different helping styles that exist between young people and family as well. So these are all pros, and with games you've got all of this great knowledge that we were talking about earlier about conventions, things to draw into it. They can draw in on their own interests in terms of creating game assets or audio. There's a lot of fantastic stuff there, but whereas the kind of fire sparking that games provide in terms of inspiring them to create something is one side of it, but on another side we've also got the pitfalls. So the pitfalls are when we've got almost a disconnect between what their expectations are in terms of the game that they're going to make and the kind of reality of the amount of time that they have and the kind of their expertise. And this was a finding that was very real, in that kind of, you know, at times there were tears when people were not able to kind of make the game that they had in their head. So yeah, working with that kind of working with the kind of advantage, like the possible for chaotic fun, but not getting into a situation where it gets out of control. You're not able to support everything as a facilitator. It's beyond your own ability to support the process is important. One strategy for that is to use 2D or retro arcade style or kind of early console platform games. By kind of restricting it in this way, you've got a common ground that through the kind of popular culture, through kind of films like Wreck-It Ralph, through Sonic, this is still in circulation now, but also parents are familiar with it as well. So again, it's finding a common ground between parents and the young people through having a bit of a limit of what you're going to work with. If you establish that quite early on, I found that it made things a lot easier. Sometimes people ask me, well, what about people who have got families who've got a negative perception towards games, gaming, or have no interest in it? Well, often even kids who are not gamers will have experience of playing games, and same with parents, or there'll be people in their family who are interested in that. So there'll still be those repositories of knowledge there. And also, just because you don't like something doesn't mean that you can't make it. Let's not underestimate the kind of pride and joy of crafting something. Even if you're not a gamer, the process of making something yourself has got its own intrinsic value to it. And parents can really see that and kind of get behind that. And kids can feel that as well. And also, working with something familiar, even if you don't like it, is useful. Same thing as you wouldn't say to someone who's learning how to make films, don't make an advert as a training exercise. I hate adverts. We've got these conventions within adverts. They're a medium that's got something you can really work with and you can subvert as well. So that kind of gives a little bit of background, a little bit of the pragmatic tactics to address some of these early issues. And I suppose it was at this stage that I wanted to kind of move into a bit of a hands-on approach, just so you get an idea of the type of thing that I've been working with, because there's only so much that I can communicate through doing it as on slides. So into the chat, I'm going to put 3 links. Oh no, I'll do 2 links to start off with. So the first one is a link to a similar game to the one that you have been playing, but it's a little bit different. It's only got 1 level, but what I want you to do is to hit edit code once you get to that first link. When you hit edit code, it should open up in this kind of way. It might take a little time. So click on that now. And while it's doing its processing, if you also open in another tab, the second link, it should take you to this page. So these slides would be printed off when the year 5 students from local primary schools would come in. The idea would be to print off these slides as like little cards, even laminate them, and to give them out as small challenges. Everyone would have this first challenge that takes them to the game, and ask them to click edit code. And what I suggest we do is, if I go through the first challenge with you, then if you could just do other ones just as you see fit. Don't feel like you need to go through them in order. So the first one, you might realise...
Mick, sorry, you've put that to everyone in the waiting room rather than to everyone in general. So you might need to just change the chat to everyone rather than everyone in the waiting room.
Everyone in the waiting room, great, okay. So that's interesting. To everyone in meeting, okay. Okay, great. Thanks for that. You've already earned your challenges. Now, at this stage, this is a little bit of a cookery show. So I'm doing things, you're doing things. There's a lot of silence, maybe occasional chat, questions in the chat. So I've invited Sam and Paul, when it's suitable, just to chip in with the cookery show banter kind of conversation, just to kind of fill the blank air while we take. And I actually do have one thing to do with you to kind of get you up and running. So hopefully you're getting towards having these 2 tabs up. I'm going to do the first one with you. So the first one is to change the jump height. You may see that this is a deliberately broken game. As we try and play it, you read the messages, we can't jump up high enough. So what we're going to do, apologies. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow the first challenge, and we're going to change it from -75 when the space bar is pressed, the A button. If it's not jumping high enough, we're going to keep it negative, but why not try doubling it to -150? If the Y velocity changes by that much, maybe it will let us jump up high enough. Oh yeah, that looks like that's a success. So we've made a change over here. And if we don't see what we're looking for, we can zoom out a little bit, and we can click and drag the coded workspace to try and find what we're after. So that's challenges based on interest, and if you have questions, ask in the chat, and we'll try and solve them.
Well, Mick,
So
so
Sam,
yeah, thanks, Mick, for doing.
I hear you've got a new show coming up.
Oh, yeah, I've got a new show called up, Mick. Exactly, Mick. Can I ask a question about Arcade MakeCode from Microsoft? Why do you think that this particular platform, as like a plug and play code platform, is better than others that do maybe a similar job?
Okay, that's good. I'm glad you asked me that, Sam, because a good question is, why not use Scratch, for example, from like MIT Labs? There's a couple of technical reasons. One is that Scratch is really difficult to program things like gravity and collisions, whereas this is very much specifically for game making. And so those kinds of common game patterns are already built in to the blocks that are there. So for example, if we went to game as one of the blocks on the left, we've got here a simple block just for game over, and that comes either game over win or game over lose. And in some ways that simplifies that process and allows you to kind of concentrate on what's special about the game. What I found with Scratch is actually often people, because it's really tailored for being a multimedia authoring environment, people would spend a lot of time on the look of things and the sound of things and that kind of visual kind of design, rather than the game mechanic elements, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely.
Whereas here, this is so stripped down that it's almost, you can't help but interact with things like systems dynamics in that way.
I mean, again, another question relating to Scratch, I guess, is with the Microsoft Arcade Maker, are all the assets there already in terms of like the music, in terms of the graphics and everything, or can you create your own and upload them as well?
So it's very limited in terms of what you can do. So with music, for example, we can play a melody, but you can see here, if I drag that in and click on the melody, that's it. That's what we're working with. We can change the BPM. We've got a limited number of notes, but that's all we're working with. The same with art. You've got a limited pixel art approach. So in some ways that's could be frustrating, but in some ways as a facilitator, it's great, because it means people don't get lost in that world of like asset creation.
Mick, that's sort of helping answer one of my worries or questions, I suppose. You talked about funds of knowledge and that those live in the family. And I'm worried about my fund of knowledge when it comes to coding with my kids. How do parents or carers working with their families kind of work with this? I mean, how easy is it for them to, have something to contribute?
I think that it's interesting to draw a little bit on like Bridget Barron's work here in the some parents take different approaches. Some are very hands-on and they're like, well, I kind of know what makes a game work, and if you do that, then it's not going to be a very good game. So they're making those design choices with the children. Others are much more, a little bit more distant, in that they will help them through the process. They'll help them overcome things that are maybe emotional blocks. They'll help them to ask for help. They'll help them in a much more social way. But often parents who thought that they wouldn't get involved in the game making do become very involved in the game making, because it's broken down into quite small steps, and therefore like, right, I can actually see myself doing this. And often parents I've had away from their offspring to make their own game, because they're like, well, I just want to kind of get going on my idea now. And I think that's real validation of the tool in some ways.
No, it looks great. And so what about, you talked about where this sits in relation to sort of learning, I suppose, I don't know what the right word is, but coding like Python, say. What's the sort of, I suppose I've got two questions really. How do you transition from this to learning that kind of coding? And I suppose secondly, is that necessary? I suppose the future of game making maybe doesn't necessarily require, I don't know whether the skills here are transferable, whether you need to then develop them.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is that although this is the kind of tool that I've ended up using for the last iteration of the study, the first tool was actually using JavaScript. And so it was using like a game library called Phaser. And so if I click on one of these links here, let's have a look. Oh yeah, so here I took a similar approach where I had a starting game that was a JavaScript game in the browser. People could edit it in a similar way, but you'd get code on the left and then your output on the right. And then they choose from different game mechanics, and by clicking on one of these, it would take you to a kind of step-by-step tutorial in a kind of in a book that I wrote, that broke it down in that way. And so what I ended up doing is, when Microsoft Arcade, I became aware of it last year, I thought, actually, do you know what? MakeCode is being used for microbits, and it's actually quite a nice system. It's also got another advantage in that you can also download this onto, if you have a look at the screen, these kind of little handheld devices as well. So again, that limit in terms of the asset creation allows you to play your game on these kind of £30 little bits of kit. And so that's fun. And I thought, well, that's so interesting that what I did is I translated the approach from a JavaScript framework just to doing the same thing with MakeCode. So I'd already done a lot of the work in terms of breaking out the different things to add to the game and theming them. And then it was just a matter of redoing the step-by-step tutorials. Well, you know, fair enough, still a lot of work, redoing the kind of screenshots so that they were suitable for MakeCode Arcade, if that makes sense.
Mick, can I ask a question as well about this? So is it chaotic fun, the term you used, which I thought was excellent? And yeah, the role, I guess, role as educators and facilitators, some people have a degree of comfort with doing that compared to others. Do you feel that,
Yeah.
you know, purposefully choosing something that in the past has been seen as quite black box, like coding games, is deliberately provocative with that chaotic fun?
I think it gets right to the heart of the matter. There is something about, I had no idea that you could do this, that I'm trying to replicate from early days of the web, where you could almost like say view code in web pages and copy and paste things together. I'm not sure if it's provocative, but more a little bit magic. You're enjoying that sensation of like, you never guess what you can do. We can actually, this is doable. This is something that we can, maybe it's a bit cheeky. It's like, yeah, they don't even, you know, you could play into that. They don't even want us to make games, but we can actually make our own games. Do you see how there's a certain subversion to that fits with a kind of media activist empowerment kind of agenda?
Absolutely. And I know a lot of your work is, you know, pan and intergenerational as well. And, you know, do you feel that picking something that is deliberately associated with a younger generation helps to address that power dynamic that sometimes comes from intergenerational work?
Yeah, I think it does. I think there is something about, oh, and also relevant to your last question, there is something about, let's take something that none of us have really got experience of, that does kind of level the playing field. And certainly kind of like, yeah, I know this better than you, Mum, is fantastic as a kind of a starting point, especially if you're kind of working with parents who are just up for giving it a go, and don't mind a bit of that. Then you start off from a really nice dynamic in that way. And there's even, and I think there are things that I've learned through doing this and trying different things out with colleagues as well, that I'm really keen to try and share to people who wouldn't think of themselves able to facilitate something like this just yet. I think there are tips and tricks that can really bring game making within the reach of people who wouldn't have engaged with it, either through worrying that it could spiral out of control and they could end up looking like an idiot for not knowing enough, or that yeah, or spiral out of control in another way, in that everyone's just doing so wildly different things that it doesn't feel like something that's achievable. I think this can be done in the classroom.
Thinking about, you sort of talk about home learners and stuff, how do you share this with that kind of body of people, because they're presumably quite hard to reach?
Well, I was bringing them into ManMet, and so it would be interesting to kind of work out how this would work in a kind of online learning context. I've thought about it, but there is something about having everyone in the same room and the kind of peer learning and community that that helps make happen, that I'm reluctant to kind of let go of at this stage.
Yeah, I very much like your picture of what looked like a giant fuzzy felt set with people making a kind of cloth platform game, or that looked really appealing.
Well, honestly, that was one of the best sessions that kind of like I've ever been involved with, really. Yeah, this idea of having something physical. I've got another picture of it somewhere. Oh, I did have. Yeah, just having something. It just proved immediately, kind of. Yeah, we're on the same platform here. We're on, literally, in this case. If you've got questions about how to use this, if you want to share your reactions to using it in this very brief interaction with it. just made that Padlet link available throughout the session. And even if you kind of do it just for 2 minutes at the end of the talk, it would be great just to get feedback or questions. All right then. Thank you for those questions, guys. That did actually make that process of getting people doing things at home.
Cheers, mate.
It's like, no worries. I just wondering if we should wait for the Padlet to come up. I think we should just keep going and then check back on it. It feels a little bit weird getting people to do something and then not getting that feedback, but that's where we are right now. So I'm happy to go with it. In terms of like the rationale for that activity and the reason for doing it in that way, it's really great to have your questions, and we covered a lot of what the reasons for doing it are, and I hope that you did experience it. It's very tricky to do this type of thing remotely, but I hope you could see that some of the design choices there are just breaking things down into small chunks to make small changes to get small changes in code to get big changes in the game. So this immediacy of feedback and like kind of scale of what you're doing, making a difference, is very much behind the reason for doing it in that way. Getting started quickly, making big effects. There's this approach of remixing and patching code that's quite well explored in the literature around Scratch and kind of digital making, but it's also been called half-baked games by some Greek researchers as well. So Googling half-baked games gets across the idea of what are the advantages of starting from a game that already is there, but just a bit broken. You're getting into those design processes and iterative approaches more quickly through having something that you can test against. And you're also quickly accessing the concept of like game balance and like systems dynamics through working with this kind of real game. As we progress, I did show you a bit of a screen for how we take it further. We probably start with a different game as a starting point, which is just had one level, and then the mission would be to choose from a range of game mechanics, things that are like about their game aesthetics, graphical effects, etc., animating your player, changes to do with the game space, design of levels, more levels, the shape of the space, and then game challenge, which kind of looks at balance and like systems elements, maybe feedback loops. So this menu allows people to kind of keep going with that approach, to choose what they want to work on next. And I suppose really it's the equivalent of a open world game where everything has to be coded, everything does have to be prepared, but it gives you the illusion of free choice. Well, you do have free choice in the order that you do things and the way that you go back to things. But also the facilitator's role is to help learners on that journey by providing kind of nudges and little missions for them to complete as well. So we'll cover a little bit of that later as well. We also covered a little bit around the limits and design decisions of MakeCode Arcade, why it's different from Scratch, and some of the benefits. Having these little controllers that you're able to click download on your screen, download it onto this machine through a USB, and then play it and pass it around the room immediately is amazing. Having that immediate play testing is something that isn't on the screen, just gives a sense of a target, a real audience, and it's incredibly motivating. And there are kind of limits which are positive as well that I kind of discussed in terms of not getting lost too much in asset creation and that side of it. And then this is the launch today of these course materials. So they're all open source and published online. There are a couple of links here that take you to the resources. One's for a GitHub page, and that has got the template. It's got these different game patterns to apply, but it's also got step-by-step instructions from first principles on how to make the game from scratch. Now, this is pretty interesting in that they've got their own tutorial system for MakeCode, which is really quite innovative. What it does is combine the making space with instructions for how to do your next step. And it also, if I was clever, I would have opened that previously. I probably have done. Yeah, okay. So that there's a shot of it there. Link to the hub, and then looking on how to do the instructions, that will show you the kind of the step by step as well. And yeah, I would really enjoy feedback. It's not totally complete. It's for testing, and if you have improvements or if you spot errors, there's a little link that tells you how to kind of report a bug, and I'll fix it. So I'm going to go on to cover some of the study specifics and some of the findings of the study. I've really done probably a bit too much work. I've probably done 5 different game making courses, different iterations, and I'm really just waiting for the design to settle down as it has now before really data collecting in earnest. But what these pilot projects have allowed me to do is to pretty much come up with a bit of a coding structure for the data. So I've organized it as in a way to be accessible to teachers as well as to researchers, and done that through when I gather the data, I'll kind of code it against learning dimensions, the things that I think the participants are learning. So dividing them up into about 4 categories, we've got this idea of coding concepts, loops, lists, data, functions, design practices, kind of iterative approaches, yeah, debugging, playtesting, remixing, collaborative production. We've got 21st century skills around kind of communication, and also kind of some of the digital skills around web navigation, kind of problem solving. And then there's one that's kind of a little bit unusual in that it's quite applied knowledge. It's wider computer patterns and systems concepts. So these are things that would be interesting in you if you wanted to explore systems thinking, systems dynamics, feedback loops, but also kind of applied computer program design as well. Things like input events and change listeners, things that are common in kind of interactive media. So I'll kind of code the data collected against that, and I'm using a 360 camera to gather the whole shebang of the participants. But then I'm also capturing what's on their screen and the audio of their interactions, and I'm able to kind of combine them so that on the left here we've got what's happening on their screen, their mouse movements, etc., and here we've got their kind of physical gestures on the right. So from that, I'll kind of code the data against it, but also I'm drawing out specific moments that are of interest to me as well. So here's one for an early JavaScript based one. It's a child working on the level design, saying, and then delete those H's in there. That's deleting hazards in the game. And the parent says, no. The child says, let me do it. It's no fun having a game without any hazards to avoid. The child says, it is for me. Goodness me, says the parent, what was the point of designing our car with fumes if we're not going to use it? And the child proceeds anyway, deleting all hazards whilst giggling and having fun doing that. Another one, I'm not going to read out in full, but the gist is the child wants to add lots of different things to the game. The parent also wants to add lots of different things to the game. And finally, once the child then says something else that he wants to add to the game, the parent says, yeah, it's like, that's what I mean. You can't just keep skipping around like that, child, because it just gets really overwhelming. So here we've kind of see the kind of pros and cons of making a game. You want to add so much to it, but it can be chaotic and confusing. So one of the questions that I kind of have really in terms of design is like, how can I help out the parents, but also the children? No one wants a kind of overwhelmed parent, as kind of lockdown kind of teaches us, really. When the parents are overwhelmed, it's no fun for the kids either. And kind of these strategies to scaffold the navigation and the goal setting, and then the reflection and support the various motivations of the learners are really kind of where I'm coming from with this design, but without losing the possibilities for that chaotic, messy learning that too structured an approach would yield. So you can see kind of where some of this design is evolved from the reactions of the people as well. So I'm going to kind of look into in more detail to three areas that aim to address that question, really. How can we support and structure without losing the fun? And the ideas of game design patterns, game maker types, kind of riffing a bit on Bartle's game player types, and the use of like a process drama that I've been working with the drama department at Faculty of Education. So if we have a look at these game design patterns first, the motivation here in terms of exploring some of almost the professional terminology, or really academic terminology, for the structure, the formal structure of the game and the interactions of the kind of systematic elements in there. I really took inspiration from the learning design around a bit of software teaching game making called Game Style Mechanic. Now this was developed in part by someone called Katie Salen, who did a lot of theoretical work on components of games and kind of helping develop a more academic and formal vocabulary for like this, what was at the time an understudied area. And from that work, the kind of rules of play, actually this comes down in a lineage from that, and it's a very much more accessible breakdown of what makes up a game. The idea of the elements of the game, the idea of game space, the goal of the game, the components, the game mechanics, and the rules. And that was used here in these cards that were given out to kind of encourage students to add different things to the game. It's been propagated and used quite widely now. You can pick up really interesting resources from these programs. Mouse are a New York group that do a game design course. Global Game Jam Next is, they've got great online resources that use this kind of approach of breaking apart a game at the first stages. And I know that actually kind of like similar practitioners have done this in our network in terms of working with adults, hacking a game like paper, scissors, stone, and just changing bits of it around as a way of exploring how games work. And also there's other resources called the Game Jam Guide as well. I used that approach to get people thinking about what makes up a game. And I found it really useful, especially in the early stages. Cracking open this mysterious box of the game and swapping things around, especially with physical games, or getting people to analyze arcade games using these categories. But it was good at the early stages, but then it became quite limiting, because that's quite nice and neat, but actually the desires for what people want to add to a game and their motivation was really about, let's add on the next feature. You can see from that interaction, there's so much they want to add that it didn't really fit within these categories very neatly. And so I wanted something that did fit, and just took a little bit of adapting, really. So we've still got some elements of this, and it actually uses bits of different frameworks mashed up and just to something that kind of works, and something that is slightly arbitrary. For example, here in game mechanics, I'm probably including elements of rules that some people would agree with, some people wouldn't. But it kind of works. So kind of putting that into a menu structure, as I've kind of demonstrated, helps. It actually helps because it means that not only are we kind of exploring these different elements as a kind of move to empower us to kind of understand what a game is right at the beginning, but we're coming back to these concepts every time that we choose a new feature to add to the game. We're coming back to these concepts, and in some ways I can make a link between what I called these, I ended up calling these game design patterns, as an overview of all of the different features here, and linking that a bit to object-orientated professional practice, where people teach computing around design patterns. And within design patterns, there's a certain, the advantage is that they're are shared in similar ways, and that there is a community of users who kind of use these design patterns regularly. Using those looks a bit like this. Okay, so what's the name of the pattern? What's the description? What's the need for the pattern? What are some of the coding concepts involved? And what are links to some of the wider computing or systemic patterns? So it gives participants a bit of a chance to reflect after they've implemented the pattern on what's happening. So they can reflect on how they've used variables, a change listener, or systems dynamics. So what I'm aiming to do is to help users navigate through the process of adding a game pattern after game pattern, but helping to kind of access coding concepts, and by concretely implementing this pattern, they're accessing coding concepts, they're using design practices and 21st century communication skills. And once they've implemented it, they then do a bit more of an abstract kind of reflection on some of the concepts like systems thinking, computing patterns that could be applied somewhere else. So this is really the hypothesis. One of the hypotheses is that I'm testing is that, does this focus really on these game patterns as the main navigational tool? Can that help both learners and facilitators to navigate this kind of complex map of learning possibilities in a flexible, potentially chaotic, but in a fruitful way? And I'm not sure about that. And one of the ways I want to find out is to kind of, as I code the data that's coming in, work out, well, how do learners kind of navigate this? So this is my hypothesis, and I need more data to really test it. So there's that. Another thing that was quite fortuitous is the use of Bartle's player types, but in the context of making. So this came about really because I found out about Bartle's player types through John Lean, who's in the kind of games reading group in the Faculty of Education, sharing that he's kind of using some of this for his PhD studies. And also just trying it out. I thought, well, this is an interesting concept. Should I get my group of learners to take the Bartle test and find out what type of game player they are? So they all did the test, and they found out whether they were either an achiever, they try and accumulate status tokens by beating rules-based challenges of the game world, an explorer, who like to discover the systems governing the operation of the game world and by roaming around. A socializer, forming relationships with other players by telling stories within the game world. Or a killer or a griefer who interfere with the functioning of the game world or the play experience of other players. And it's divided into this quadrant. Killers like acting on other players, socializers like interacting with players, achievers like acting on the world, and explorers like interacting with the world. So it didn't take much really to think, well, okay, there were interesting ones here, because I noticed that the killers, for example, in our group who said that they were killers, they were often what I would say glitchers. They enjoyed, and I'll swap this around a bit just to experiment with game maker types. They enjoyed like messing around with the code in a way that would surprise other people. I would call them glitchers, trying to get glitches to happen in the game to cause surprise or mischief. And then the achievers were more kind of people who would, they would act on game making in the kind of accepted conventional way, trying to kind of apply concepts and make an acceptable game, a good game obviously, but quite straightforward. Magpies would like pick off different things and quickly trying to find out what other people were kind of doing and throw them into their game. And socializers were kind of interested in socializing with their peer makers and finding out what they were up to. They form relationships with other game makers and find out more about their work. They would also tell stories within their game as well. So this helped me actually, because I thought in my design, am I actually catering? And I'm not saying, and Bartle's not saying that people are any one of these types and don't enjoy the other things. This isn't a learning styles thing. He's saying, let's use these different categories to accept and understand that people play games for different reasons, and therefore you can design games for different player experiences within the same game. And I'm also, I guess, saying for facilitators, we can facilitate our game making sessions to take account into the fact that people make games for different reasons as well, and allowing them to interact with your learning design and do different things is great for serving that need, giving them that choice. So what I noticed is that for planners and magpies, they were quite well catered for. Magpies have got these list of different game patterns that they can pick from and choose and integrate into their game. Planners can go through the step-by-step instructions and learn how to make the game from first principles, so they understand everything in the game, and so they don't find that stressful working with things that they don't understand. And what was also interesting for me is like, well, how can we support these glitchers or socializers a bit more as well? And one of the reasons for sharing this is that the next part, the kind of some of the drama processes that I've been working with, and I suppose a good example is to show you a bit of a photo of an open day for Manchester Met during the Community Learning Festival, working with the drama department to do like a playful game where it was called Pirate Pete's Video Arcade. We brought people in and again, we asked them to kind of design a game together. Alison Ramsey and Rebecca Patterson have been fantastic in supporting and kind of applying some of the techniques of creating a drama process to the idea of making games or kind of coding media in general. To put it in a nutshell, you could say that we were exploring the idea of like coding in role. So using drama techniques to create a playful environment and to reduce some learner anxiety, to open up different possibilities. There's a link with the work called Mantle of the Expert by Dorothy Heathcote. They often explore writing in role. So this is kind of updating it for different skills really, and asking the question, if we do want to use drama processes to help some of these different game maker types, how can we do it? And often, actually, this is kind of inevitable, I guess, but there's a bit of an idea of like a sourdough metaphor here, where if you're trying to create a culture, what I found was if you had people who've been part of the previous game making session or program, and they came along to the next one, they were fantastic at kind of engendering the kind of behaviors that you want to see from a game making community, the kind of supportive play testing of each other's work, the kinds of borrowing of ideas or suggestions, to have a couple of families join the next batch just to help that happen amazingly. But what if you don't have that kind of culture? How can you kind of seed what is the yeast, I suppose, in this metaphor? How can drama processes help these kind of glitches and socializers, especially? So some of the ideas within that were to create a fictional narrative. We did one called Digital Braves a few different times, and this was a bit of a dystopian fiction where people were taken away and given a choice, and the choice was no, actually they weren't given a choice. They were asked to complete a personality test, and they were either told they were a game maker or a game player, and they were told they were going to be separated from their families, and the population were to be divided. There was a fiction around that, and this process of creating emotional involvement with the process, and a training session was given, where in order to subvert the system, players had to make a certain type of game. So they were then coding in role in order to subvert and react against a fictional narrative. And this process of bringing people together, I think it addressed a couple of things. One was it was fun. It set up a playful atmosphere. But another one was it actually allowed parents to explore issues of concern. They might have concern around games as a culture. They might have concern around violence in video games, screen time, implications for social development of their children, implications around displacing other healthy activities. And this kind of opening drama as a way of getting these discussions out, and actually, just to be honest, and in a debrief, say this is why we're doing it, is because we really see that there's value in game making. We see it's very empowering. We don't see it as the be all and end all. To say, personally, I'm coming much more from an empowerment agenda rather than a STEM industry pipeline. Having that ability to kind of share that allowed us to really address some of the concerns of parents. So that was one of the reasons. Another one of the reasons for doing this is that it then allowed us to drip feed missions into later stages. And these missions would help different maker types. So here, these public missions were given out, and then people who are socializers could follow these missions, and they might make a list of characters in 2 of the other games being made. They might find out who plays the most computer games in the group. It gave them an impetus and a license to indulge some of those things that they want to get out of making. And the glitchers had more cheeky secret missions, some of which were incredibly successful. You know, they were very engaged in the way that they were messing up other people's experiences and being naughty. And that license to be naughty really helped their sustained engagement in the process, and that really came out in some of the post-session interviews with families. Both parents and the young people saw the value of that license to just be a bit naughty at times, and that kind of addresses these different maker types. There's also, for me as a facilitator, the possibility to nudge learning in different directions. Often what I found with the JavaScript approach is that they wouldn't be looking at game balance and systems as much as maybe I thought they could. And so I was able just to bump them out of their comfort zone a bit by giving missions around maybe adding new mechanics and balancing the game out, or just missions around like systems thinking, like maybe like a chain reaction crate that allowed the exploration of concepts like feedback loops. Yeah, and the other great thing that helped me as a facilitator is that when I'm in the middle of a session trying to fulfill the requests and needs of everyone as they come into problems, I often forget to ask them to reflect at the end of sessions and reflect on their learning. And I also sometimes feel a bit uncomfortable because it feels like the boring bit at the end of a session. But allowing for a reflection in role. At one time we had like aliens who'd set the missions, and the aliens wanted progress reports. So we would gather around a screen that we'd do a screen recording of them showing their progress. And doing this reflection in role also really helped me as a facilitator to make sure that I did that and to feel comfortable doing that. So that's pretty much, yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, you can see here that a lot of this is around the evolution of the design. And I've kind of covered different things like using these learning dimensions, not only as a coding tool for research, but also as a map to help the navigation of facilitators and learners. I've looked at the idea of using game design patterns almost in a professional way to help support a community, but also as a thread, a story through which these other learning dimensions are explored. There's a fun bit on game maker types instead of game player types as really a kind of bit of a tool to help look at the design and make sure the needs of different people are covered. I'm not holding that up as any bit of serious research. I'm holding it up as just a tool to help reflection on the design, really. And then the idea of that once you've got these different types of makers and you're thinking about them, how can you use playful elements, including a process drama, to cater for these kind of diverse learner maker types, and kind of what's a fun way of doing that. And I would actually have to say that working on doing that, so it doesn't require any particular drama skills or just in a non dramery way, is something that's very possible as well. So that's the end of what I wanted to cover. We've got like a little bit of time for questions, and yeah, thank you for listening.
Thanks, Mick. That was really great. I think in the interest of time, we might ask people to put any questions they've got on the Padlet and to follow up with you directly after the talk. But I just checked on the Padlet and there's loads of great stuff that's going on there as well already. And people were saying in the chat as well, thanks very much for the talk. So I'm gonna say thank you very much, Mick, and then I'm gonna hit stop record. So thank you very much, Mick, for that great